What's up, A-Pushers? Today we're going to continue our saga of the Cold War with Lyndon B. Johnson, the president who is going to be president immediately after the assassination of John F. Kennedy in 1963. So basically, let's start over here with the Great Society. There's a book, and the book is very similar to Jacob Riis's How the Other Half Lives. It's called The Other American. It says in there, written by a socialist named Michael Harrington, that there's 40 to 50 million Americans at or below the poverty line. And Lyndon B. Johnson grows up in poverty in Texas, and his goal with the Great Society is to continue the New Deal under Franklin Delano Roosevelt and to end poverty and racial discrimination in America forever. So the goal? End poverty and racial discrimination in America. Ultimately, it's going to be somewhat successful, but not as fully successful as it could be because of, obviously, the war in Vietnam is going to be the thing that Johnson is remembered for. There are some programs that you should know. Medicare, you should care about old people, and so it gives money to people 65 years or older for health insurance. Medicaid gives money to people that can't afford, so people at or below the poverty line. Public housing, this is where the housing projects come into play. If you can't afford housing, the government will take care of you to some extent. There's requirements for that. Office of Economic Opportunity gives money for higher education, so those student loans that you love so much, that's where that comes from and originates. Immigration Act of 1965 gets rid of the immigration quota system of the 1920s where we didn't like immigrants from Southeastern Europe. Now we just have a big quota system as opposed to just specified for each country. Head Start is going to give money and education for nutrition information to make sure that kids at or below poverty, at the poverty level, will be well nourished and basically have getting the nutrients and everything that they need to think and to act and to be the best citizens that they can be. Food stamps gives reduced food to people, and affirmative action ends discrimination in terms and for the hiring process. So no discrimination based on race or based on sex in terms of education and eventually housing. All right, so that's the Great Society. That's what Johnson wants to accomplish, LBJ. But what ultimately is going to transpire is the escalation of the war in Vietnam. You should know that in 1964, the war is very popular. By the end, it is not. By 1968, it is not very popular, and people are going to say, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? So let's find out exactly what happens here. There's this situation called the Gulf of Tonkin where the USS Maddox and the USS Sea Turner Joy are attacked in international waters off the coast of North Vietnam. Realistically, the first boat, the USS Maddox, has like a bullet hole in it. The second boat doesn't really have it. That attack probably never happens. And so what happens is that there's this thing called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, and it increases the power of the president over troops. In Congress, it was almost unanimously voted. Only 2 people voted against this in Congress, and it gave LBJ a blank check. War is not officially declared, and so what starts happening is escalation of troops in Vietnam. Ultimately, it's going to be approximately 500,000 Americans are going to go over to Vietnam. So we escalate troops, and then there's also something called Operation Rolling Thunder, where we bomb North Vietnam, and those targets are picked by Robert McNamara, and the troops in Vietnam are going to be led by General William Westmoreland. All right, so the war is popular, but we keep adding troops every year. It doubles. There's the draft, or every month the draft doubles, as we need more and more troops. And then there's something called the Tet Offensive. Americans believe that the war was almost over. That's what the government kept saying. And then on the Lunar New Year in Vietnam, a day that was usually peaceful, all of the Viet Cong start simultaneously attacking U.S. bases, U.S. areas, and it gets caught on national television. And the war becomes unpopular because of television. People like Walter Cronkite are going to say that the war is unwinnable, and Walter Cronkite was a CBS News reporter who Americans trusted, and when he turns against the war, LBJ says, well, I've just lost middle American support for this war. That's where you really start seeing those anti-war demonstrations take place. That's basically escalation in Vietnam in a nutshell. Now we move on to the civil rights. A couple of important landmarks. You could spend a whole year on this, so I'm going to try to abbreviate as quickly as I possibly can. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 ends discrimination in America. It was John F. Kennedy's dream that be passed. John F. Kennedy's assassination actually really helps the civil rights movement because this bill would have been very difficult to pass, but now if you vote against it, you're voting against the slain president. Freedom Summer and Mississippi Burning go hand in hand together. Freedom Summer was register black voters in Mississippi, the most racist state. And so they start setting up what are called freedom schools and educating people to vote that are black in the South. And Mississippi burning is an instance that happens where 3 activists, 2 of them are white, 1 of them is black, are going to be killed by the Ku Klux Klan. Their bodies are going to go missing. So these activists that go down to the South, they're really putting their lives on the line. There is a trial, and of course it's in the South, and these people are found not guilty, even though it's very clear that they did it, and later on there's a retrial and they're guilty. Black nationalism is the rise of Malcolm X, and violent civil disobedience, saying that there's white America and black America. They can never fully be together because it's never worked, so just separate them, keep them separate together. Project Alabama is very similar to the Mississippi Freedom Project, and basically the goal was to raise awareness for the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to end all forms of voting and restrictions, I guess. So there's a march in Selma. If you've ever seen the movie Selma, you know what this is about. What they want to do is, Selma, Alabama had like 2 or 3% of the population that was black actually voting, and so the goal was to raise awareness for this and march from Selma to Montgomery, which is about 54 miles. When they march, the police are going to stop them on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, tell them to turn around. Of course, the civil rights activists refuse, and then on national television you see innocent people getting beat up, run over by horses, and it's very, very, very bad. Dr. King will join this march, and eventually they will march, and it leads to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the famous phrase here is the civil rights song, "We shall overcome," and LBJ tells Congress, "We shall overcome all forms of racial discrimination." So, yeah, a victory again for the Great Society. Now, it seems like all things is well and good in America, but what happens in 1965 is, yes, things are being done for blacks in the South, but not for the urban centers. And blacks feel like nothing's being done for them. And so in 1965 in the summer, there's what's called the Watts riot. A guy named Marquis Fry gets pulled over by police, and he gets beat up, and it turns into racial violence, and it spreads throughout the United States, and LBJ's going, "What the heck? I thought that we were doing progress for you guys, but obviously it's not working." The Chicago Freedom Movement is Dr. King switches from, now we've got blacks getting the right to vote, now let's go to no forms of housing discrimination. And so he leads a march in Chicago, and it actually turns very violent, not violent in terms of people dying, but the things that they were saying and doing to the civil rights activists was in some cases worse than what they were doing in the South. The Poor People's March, Dr. King is going to go down to Memphis, Tennessee, and he's going to help sanitation workers who aren't being paid an equal wage. Remember, the civil rights movement isn't just about blacks, it's about everybody. And he is going to be killed by James Earl Ray on his balcony, and he will be assassinated, and Bobby Kennedy calms the nation down, saying, "Look, I know what it's like to have somebody assassinated in my family, and so please don't erupt in violence," but violence does erupt in all major cities in the United States. Eventually, you have the Civil Rights Act of 1968, which is what the Chicago Freedom Movement was trying to accomplish, which is no forms of housing discrimination for black people. 1968 Olympics, Tommy Smith wins the 200-meter dash in Mexico City, and he wears the black glove symbolizing black power, wears a scarf around his neck, symbolizing lynching in America, and he puts his hand up, says the Lord's Prayer, but refuses to look at the American flag, and he gets his medal stripped away, and John Carlos, who takes 3rd place, also gets his medal stripped away, and he was also black. Very famous image, 1968 Olympics. All right, so Great Society, Escalation in Vietnam, Civil Rights Movement, those are the biggies, and now we move into the new left and new right. All right, so the new left is, of course, basically the Civil Rights Movement impacting other groups. So the first group is the National Organization of Women, led by Betty Friedan, who wrote The Feminine Mystique. There's a magazine that is very famous called Miss Magazine, supporting women's liberation movement. The 1968 Miss America pageant, there's a bunch of protesters outside, and they crown a sheep Miss America because they say women are not just pieces of meat, so here's your real piece of meat, and so they're ridiculing the 1968 Atlantic City, New Jersey Miss America pageant. In terms of Native American rights, AIM, the American Indian Movement, is gaining strength, and they take Alcatraz Island, which now it's probably you know best for the prison that's there. But it used to be Native American holy ground, and so they take it back to symbolize that not enough is being done for Native Americans. The Chicano movement, there's boycotts and murals led by Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez. They're continuing their struggle, and they ultimately will be successful. The anti-war movement, the main group that you need to know is Students for a Democratic Society. This is where all the protests are starting to happen. There's the Vietnam veterans against the war and against fragging. But basically, just know in 1968 the war becomes largely unpopular with the American people. Okay, we're almost there. Hold on, buckle up. With the Warren Court, remember the Warren Court begins in 1953. Their first major decision is Brown versus Topeka Board of Education. And it's always about increasing civil rights and civil liberties. So the Warren Commission report, the first thing they do is they say that Lee Harvey Oswald, the guy that killed John F. Kennedy, he acted alone. Because a lot of people, even till this day, believe that there's a conspiracy. And so Johnson sets up a special commission, and they in fact find that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone gunman. There was no conspiracy, and Lee Harvey Oswald did act alone in that, and he had actually tried to kill a general before that. So this guy was denied citizenship to Russia. He tried to kill someone before, so he was a man that wanted to be remembered, and he had a screw or two loose up in his head. But if you want to be a conspiracy theorist, that's fine. Believe it. Just make sure you do your research. All right. The New York Times versus Sullivan. The main thing you need to know is that freedom of speech, and you can say whatever you want as long as it is true. It's very similar to the Zanger trial way back in the 1700s. Griswold versus Connecticut basically says that the birth control pill is out and you cannot deny it. So the states cannot deny birth control. Miranda versus Arizona, due process of law. This is where your Miranda rights come from. If you are going to be arrested, your rights have to be read to you. You have the right to remain silent because the guy, Miranda, actually confessed to a crime. He wasn't mentally stable. He confessed to a crime after police interrogation that he actually didn't fully commit. And Baker versus Carr, one person, one vote. Redistricting has to have the same number of people in each district. You can't be like, oh, I want all the Republicans over here, Democrats over here in a smaller district. No, it's just one person, one vote for district lines for voting registration. All right, almost there. Amendments. The 14th Amendment basically is very similar to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which said that there are no restrictions on voting, so no more poll taxes, and the federal government will enforce this. The 25th Amendment is the succession of the presidency, and the list goes on and on and on for about 40 people. In case the president's killed and the vice president's killed, well, who becomes president next? Okay? 1968, one hell of a year for the United States. You have the Tet Offensive, which we talked about earlier. The war becomes unpopular. Dr. King is killed. A couple months later, Bobby Kennedy is going to be killed by Saran. Then you have the My Lai Massacre, which is basically U.S. soldiers committing war atrocities because combat in Vietnam, you don't know who the enemy is, who the friend is, and so there's a village that's going to be under attack. They thought there were VC there, and then it leads to the slaughter, and it's very tragic in the nation's history. 1968 with Black Power, and then the Democratic National Convention. There's war protests happening outside in Chicago, down with the war, F.U. Daley, who is the mayor, and inside you have people that are rioting and protesting. It's an absolute mess. With the Democratic National Convention, and the police are going to use violence outside against protesters. There's what are called daily dozers, which are jeeps with barbed wire. They push the crowd, and then there's tear gas, and it's America's falling apart, and it's very clear that in the next election, it's going to be a Republican president, Richard Nixon. In terms of counterculture, it's the hippie movement, man, and it starts in Haight-Ashbury district in San Francisco. LSD and marijuana are the drugs of choice. Hippies are peaceful. They start communes. But it's not just in San Francisco. It's also in the Lower East Side. But it's rock and roll, folk music, Bob Dylan, the Grateful Dead, Jimi Hendrix. And ladies and gentlemen, that is, it's the 60s, man. It's Lyndon B. Johnson from 1963 to 1969. An important note to remember that the 60s, as you know, with the radicalism, the protests, begins with John F. Kennedy being assassinated. That's when the 60s really begin. And it ends really with, very tragically for Lyndon B. Johnson, he wanted a great society. He tells the American people that he will not run for president again, and he is done. So I wish you well. The A-Push exam is right around the corner. Study well, and may the force be with you.